Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two Worlds podcast. I am starting us off today, and I am Barney, and I am joined by my co-host, and he is
Jacob.
And you may notice that in a few minutes, if you're watching, that we're wearing different clothes in the next little bit of our episode here. That's because after finishing the last episode that we discussed our favorite translations and other aspects of the Bible, we realized that we came across kind of maybe two kind of distinct directions that the podcast went in. And while they interwound and kind of wove well together, we also thought that maybe they work really well separately too. So we decided to try that and separate them into two different kind of more in-depth looks or more specific looks with a theme in the Bible. Today, we want to focus a little bit more on kind of the more technical, more kind of nitty-gritty aspects of Bibles and translations, and that you'll hear us discuss in a little bit. We also have the benefit of kind of taking a moment to reflect on some things that we talked about in the last episode, or maybe wanted to talk about that we didn't get to. One question that I came to mind during the episode and then didn't quite have the chance to ask or forgot to was I wanted to look a little bit about Jacob's time in high school again. I remember seeing on History Channel there had a little TV show about parts of the Bible that are not included in the Protestant Bible, and they talk about certain letters from the apostles and maybe certain books that would be in the Old Testament that we don't read all the time in our church, maybe. And I was interested to see how they said Daniel is actually a longer book. And they decided to shorten it a bit, according to the people on the show, because it was too popular. And everyone loved reading about Daniel. And they thought, well, this is kind of taken away from the other books. And so they took it out. This is what they said, to kind of bring a little bit more balance to the other prophets. But I personally have never read any of the books that are included in the Apocrypha, but I kind of know a bit about them, or I'm a little bit familiar, especially with like First and Second Maccabees, and kind of we know that that's where the story of Hanukkah comes from. How was it, Jacob, in high school? Did you really study the books of the Apocrypha in depth, or was it something that you just ran across here and there? And then what's kind of your general opinion, having had the chance to look at those throughout your time in high school, and then later on, I'm assuming, as you were studying?
Yes, it was so interesting to read the Apocrypha, and we know that those books, many of them are in Greek and are part of the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, and they just had such a long-standing place in the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic tradition. Because of that, it came into the Latin version that the Catholic Church used, the Vulgate, and has been retained as part of their canon of Scripture. But for me, when I went in as a freshman to high school and was entering the discussions of Catholic doctrine and theology, and we were opening up the Bibles that they asked every student to buy, I was very unsure, like, how do I understand these books? Because they'd never been in the Bible that I had grown up with in the Protestant canon. So I agree with you 100% that the books relating to the Maccabees are so fascinating, because they unpack this whole history between the testaments of what transpired, because that really was a historical gap for me growing up. I just didn't think about it very much, of what happened in that intervening period. And so having that was fascinating. And then I did come to appreciate some of the unique content as we delved into a number of these books. I remember Wisdom of Ben Sira. Actually, that is a unique one within the Apocrypha, because they have a Hebrew version of that that exists. That is another reference, but it has its own cadence and sense of flavor that adds to the rich tradition of the wisdom literature, like the Psalms and Proverbs, and it fits right in. And I remember reading a quote from that book of wisdom and thinking, wow, that is really rich. So to answer your question, I was very suspicious as a Protestant Christian coming in, like, how do I view these books? They weren't included in our canon. But then as I read through a lot of the materials, I thought, oh, these are valuable devotionally. They're not part of my tradition, so I wouldn't use them as often, but I'm okay with talking about them with other Christians and them being even in a translation of the Bible. For example, the NRSV, which is a ecumenical translation done by scholars across the spectrum of Christian denominations, includes the Apocrypha. And so I think that's really fascinating that different Christian traditions could come together and produce a common Bible translation like that. So, but I think there's a lot of richness. I think that there are certain aspects of the Apocrypha, a few verses here or there that certain Protestants historically had concerns about. I remember, I think it might be in one of the books of Maccabees where there is some reference that can be interpreted as praying for the dead or those who had already departed or fallen in battle or something. And but once again, that's a certain form of interpretation of that passage. But I know maybe not every aspect would every Protestant Christian say, oh, I can fully relate to that. But I think there's a lot of richness there. And so I think, though, the fact that our canon doesn't have it is okay. Like, I think we have the Old and the New Testament have that fullness and richness there. But if people also want to include the Apocrypha, I think that can also be an additional thing to enjoy. So, yeah.
I really like what you said just at the end, where without it, the Bible seems, just very, good as it is, and that with it, though, there's a lot of extra that we can get, because it's, especially when you're younger, or maybe even into high school age, you kind of, it doesn't dawn on you, or at least in my case, that there's like 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament. You kind of just think, oh, well, then it just continued, but there was really a lot that happened, that eventually we pick up with.
100%. And Barney, on that same idea, as a Protestant, sometimes I would think that way too about the early church and the Reformation, kind of thinking, oh, after Acts, really we pick back up in the Reformation era, but, kind of discovering church history and what they call patristics, or the study of the early Christian authors and writers, you discover that there were also apocryphal books for the New Testament that appear in some of the early codices, Bible collections of books. Codex Sinaiticus had a few extra books that didn't make it into our New Testament canon. And then you also find that there were other early Christian writers, sometimes called the apostolic fathers or apostolic authors, that were writing in the 1st and 2nd century and beyond, that really give us more context of that period right after the New Testament is drawing to a close. And it's rich to have that extra history. It's not in our canon, but it's good to be aware of it. This one book called the Didache, which is the teaching of the 12 apostles, is a distillation of like doctrinal principles and ethics from the New Testament in very accessible, almost like a manual of discipleship or catechism. It's a very early source. I wish every Christian group, church, could at least have at one point like a Bible study with that. That's a very fascinating document, and it talks about baptism and different practices. And so, to answer your question, I think it's just helpful for us to have a broader view of history, and anytime things come into our lives that do that, that's a positive thing. So,
yeah, and I like that, and I was first kind of introduced to that when I was at Goshen College, and again, it was one of those things that I didn't realize that there's so much more happening, because you just kind of think that, then from Old Testament to New Testament, it happens right away. And then once we close our Bible, now it's me, and then like nothing else has really happened. But yeah, exactly. Like so much else happened, and that we got into. and that there is so much to read that happens just soon, while the church is just so young then. And just one other comment that kind of occurred to me when we were talking about the Apocrypha, I kind of think like it's really too bad that kind of in the English language, we can use the term apocryphal as kind of meaning something that's not necessarily true or something that's made up, when we can say someone, oh, that story you're telling, it's just apocryphal, it's not true. And it's kind of too bad that when like we kind of tend to feel hesitant saying, part of the Apocrypha, is it bad to say that, but yeah, like you say, there's really a lot to look into. And however you read it, however you feel in your heart, I think like it's really worth something to look into, because it was written and can fill, in that time and fill in the gaps and add quite maybe like you said, a richer understanding of the Bible.
It's also interesting too to think about. There are certain examples. I think of one in particular. I think it's from the book of Jude, in which a New Testament book alludes to one of these writings that aren't in our canon. I believe it's referring to First Enoch, when it's talking about these fallen angels, and that is not even in the Apocrypha. That's what's in sometimes called the pseudepigraphal writings, but it was a widely circulated, also spiritual writing, that was kind of concurrent with the Apocrypha. But it seems that there's a potential reference in Jude, if I'm not mistaken, to something from First Enoch. So it's fascinating how some of the books that we do have in our canon may have been aware of or in contact with some of the other literature that was out there. And but last week, as I thought back on our conversation, and I'm so glad you were willing to do this second dive into the material and represent the other half of our podcast from last time. I was wondering, why did I jump into the long, drawn out discussion of textual transmission of the New Testament when you asked me, Jacob, when you think of the Bible, what's one of the first things you think of? And I think it's, I love stories about how things come together. Like maybe for me, the transmission of the Bible and how we understand it, to me, is amazing. And so on further reflection, I was realizing I was getting kind of ahead of myself in talking about what's leading up to the thing that I appreciate, because obviously for me, the Bible itself is the main focus. But when we think of all the people over now thousands of years that faithfully copied and read and invested time in passing on these what started out as different writings that were then collected and then bound in codices, and it's very encouraging to me. It's inspiring, and so part of the story of the text itself is all the people behind the scenes who were passing it along and copying it and helping us today to have this wonderful source of scripture. And so anyway, I think some of my academic dimensions of my journey with that were, I was excited to unpack them. And so that's why I launched into that. But now in today's podcast, it's great that we can do that. And I'm also excited too for our listeners to hear a little bit too, Barney, about your context in Japan, because I know that in that podcast, you'll mention some of the ways in which these conversations of texts and critical editions of New Testament relate to even the scripture that's available there in Japan, which will be really neat for people to hear.
Then as I started reading things on, digitally, then I had the chance to experience a lot of different translations and really start to see the Bible in a different light through that way. How about for yourself?
Well, for me, similar to you, I think of trying to find translations that will bring out the richness of their original languages as much as possible. One of my favorite books from seminary is this book here called From Text to Translation. And it tries to paint a picture of how we received the Bible texts, how they were copied, how they were passed down, the different types of sources that modern scholars draw upon when they're doing a Bible translation, ancient codices and manuscripts. And interestingly enough, I picked out one part of this for today. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the screen, but there's this map that the author has, and he basically highlights different types of textual families that the New Testament manuscripts fall under. And what he means by that is in different regions around the Mediterranean, as the texts were being copied over time, they had certain characteristics, certain idiosyncrasies, because copyists sometimes make errors, they omit something, they add something, and over enough years as that happens, then the manuscripts themselves seem to have some unique qualities. And so he talks about a Western text type and a Byzantine text type and Caesarean and Alexandrian, and evidently talking about modern translations or very well-known translations, up until the time of the Reformation, they had available to them what is called the received text, which is from the Byzantine text family. And so the authorized version, the King James Version, was translated using that as the basis of the Greek New Testament. And I would assume around that same time when Erasmus released, he was a scholar in that era, he released a Greek New Testament that was widely used, that the best manuscripts they had available were from that Byzantine text family. But since then, in more recent years, they found older copies in the Alexandrian family, and Codex Alexandrinus and Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, that would show maybe even what seems like earlier renderings of the text. And so modern translations often use eclectic texts, which lay the different ancient texts beside each other and try to, through textual criticism, arrive at a text that represents the earliest form that we have without additions or without glosses or changes, and trying to correct omissions. So anyway, I thought it's interesting to highlight a couple of examples where we see this happening. In the King James Version, if you look at the Lord's Prayer, at the very end of it, when you come to the line that says, "Deliver us from evil," in the Byzantine text type, you have an additional line that says, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." But in the older text type, that line isn't there. And so the theory is, if they actually have a textual commentary to the Greek New Testament that you can read, that where the committee that produces some of these modern critical editions of the Greek text will talk about theories of why they think this or that reading is there. And they think that that additional line was added because in the Byzantine text, that prayer was used in the liturgy of the Byzantine regular worship, and that line was added in its liturgical use to the end of the text. So they're thinking a copyist, somebody who has the work of reproducing the text, is so familiar with that additional part of the text functioning in worship that they just added that line in as they were copying. So that's a really interesting example of a difference.
So just at the end, I was thinking, and actually while you were kind of mentioning the journey that the Bible translations have gone through, I was wondering if, it's kind of one of those things that becomes true through tradition, or becomes fact through use, like the fact that everyone was using the Byzantine text for so long, it kind of became default. And then it could be easy to think, well, maybe we have this text translation the way that we do because we're supposed to have it this way. And this is the one that we're just supposed to have, and then I can see how maybe people would go to one end thinking that, everything is the way it is for a reason and things have fallen in place this way so that we're supposed to use this text. But then of course it could just as easily think that, well, we've been given these new texts for a reason to look at them as well. So it is interesting to hear your colleagues or your fellow students' opinion in that way, and I can see how people might end up thinking that, and that's interesting. And another thought I had about King James is sometimes I like it because the language is so different from modern English that you really forces you to take your time with it. And so you have to go slowly to understand, to get through the these and the thous and things like that. And maybe reread things a few times to decipher this language that's there. And sometimes it's just too hard for me personally. And then it's nice to switch to something that I can access a lot easier. And then the other thought that I had that I wanted to ask you about. So the Bible in Japanese has recently they've come up with a new edition, maybe just 3 years ago or so, and I think it's only maybe their third edition or so throughout all of this time. And Shiraishi Sensei was talking with me, and he said to me, well, what edition does it say that my Bible is based on? And then I was looking, I was like, well, I don't know. And then he said, yeah, it's probably in the preface. And I checked in, and the one that I have here is on the 27th edition. And then he was saying, well, the reason why they decided to have a new edition for the Japanese Bible is because they're using the 29th edition. And I wonder exactly how much is different. They actually, I don't want to say cleaned up, but another thing that they did is kind of made the Psalms more accessible. So I'm going to have to use some Japanese, but there's the very, very polite form of I, and it is watakushi. And then there's just the standard, but still polite form of I, which is watashi. And they changed that from watakushi, the more formal, really kind of older version, to watashi, to kind of make it more accessible and also kind of make the rhythm of the psalm sound better. So they made a few different changes, but especially he was mentioning about the 29th edition of that text, and I'm curious how much you're familiar with that, and how much the changes are.
In this book I had mentioned earlier, From Text to Translation, I don't know how well you can see this chart, but
maybe pull it back a little bit.
He takes a number of modern English translations, and within a chart, he shows you what version of the Greek New Testament they're derived from. So, for example, the NIV and the NRSV are from the 25th edition, but the New Living Translation and the Message are from the 27th edition. So, as you know, newer translations come out, they use the more recent edition. The NASB, which is a very literal word for word equivalency translation, uses the 23rd edition. And then, like as I said earlier, something like the King James Version or the New King James Version uses the received text, the Textus Receptus. So those are some examples of just several modern translations using different, well, King James isn't modern, but the New King James Version is a modern translation using different sources. So that's very fascinating. The other thing it's interesting to think about is how language changes over time and usage changes over time. So philosophically, if we're wanting to represent afresh to each new generation our best understanding of the Greek and the Hebrew texts of the Bible, it seems like we need ongoing
Mhm.
fresh translations. And as we learn more about the original text, like with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learned a lot about the Hebrew text, and it affirmed a lot of what we already
Mhm.
had from the received text. Or with the discovery of what they call papyri, and these fragments of the New Testament that date back very far. That gave us incredibly new insight. So with new archaeological discoveries, we gather more information. So it seems like new translations can benefit from this, and
Mhm.
so why not include that? And a lot of Bibles will also have some notes in the margins that will tell people a little bit about the readings. If there's a variant reading or another addition or something to a text, they'll often specify that, which was fascinating. But as you were talking there, you mentioned the King James Version can still be meaningful for you because the language engages you in a different way. The formal language can kind of draw you out of a certain mindset. And it makes me think, why not think of the different types of translations that exist for different purposes? Like one might use the Living Bible or the New Living Translation or the Message, which are paraphrases. Pardon me, the New Living is not, but the Living Bible or the Message is a paraphrase for devotions, or kind of when you want to encounter the text in a way that you want it to speak to you in a free flowing language. It's really gets the concepts across. But if you're doing some formal study in the classroom, you might want something that's more of a word for word formal translation. So you'd use probably like the NRSV, or like you said, the English Standard Version, or the NASB, one of these that tries to really render word for word. Sometimes in a church setting, you want something in between that flows well, but also it follows the text pretty closely and translates more maybe thought for thought instead of word for word, but it's not a paraphrase. Something like the NIV, New International Version, which itself has had multiple revisions. At one point, the today's New International Version, and then in 2011, yet another modernized NIV. So even translations themselves have updates. So it's fascinating to think of. Or specific audiences. Like I know that there was a Jewish Publication Society translation of the Old Testament called the Tanakh, and it is an attempt to use the text of the Old Testament specifically in a Jewish context and for Jewish liturgy. And so it's fascinating. Do you have any stories that you'd like to share about specific translations you've used, or maybe specific Bible passages that jump out to you as you're using the translations?
Yeah. I think maybe it's, I don't know if this is necessarily embarrassing, but sometimes I say that this is kind of a Mennonite joke, but I I I stuck. One reason why I stuck with the English Standard Version for so long is because on Kindle it's free, and then I found also on Kindle and also for free is the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and I didn't know much about that translation at all, but one of my friends was doing a thing a few years ago, like kind of not a, a chain thing, but kind of like passing things along through email. And like she had this thing where like, you know, please send your favorite Bible verse to this person, listed below, and then show this person will get lots of different Bible verses from people that they don't know, and just kind of a way to build them up. And as I was reading through the Holman Christian Standard Bible, well, I came across Numbers 29:1, and I think probably in maybe most translations it says that this is should be a day talking about different festivals for blowing the trumpets. Maybe the silver trumpets that God told Moses to have made. But in the Holman Christian Standard translation, they say that it should be a day of joyful shouting. I just think that's just so great to think of what a great way to celebrate our love for God, and just joyfully shouting. And I'd never run into anything like that. And it's just these really small things that that kind of make different translations or different parts that you read really speak to you in different ways. I think that one of my favorite verses is at the end of Malachi, and it's Malachi 4 2, and I think that if you read the English Standard Version, I just have it here with me. It says, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. And you shall go out leaping like calves from the stall." And it just has such a great image in it. But I didn't like stall. Maybe growing up helping my dad with the sheep, my image of a stall is not exactly so clean. And I saw a different translation that said, like leaping through the pasture. I thought, oh yeah, that's way better. Because you can see the verdure and the green and the clover and just this calf that's just jumping for joy because of God. And yeah, it's those kind of things that I really think I have a million that I could talk about, but seeing it through a different lens, through the different translations, really makes different verses speak to you for different reasons, I think. Are there any of those that come to mind for you?
Yes. I'm so glad you highlighted that. I think that's very true because language is so rich, and any given word can have different renderings and when going from one language to another. So it's so rich to think about the different possibilities and to lay them side by side. For me, I think of Proverbs chapter 30. It's the sayings or the words of a person named Agur. And there's this part of that chapter where he says, he's praying to God and he says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches." So he's basically saying, if I'm rich, I may become, too self-sufficient and lose sight of you. And if I'm poor, I may be tempted to steal. But give me neither poverty nor riches, but only give me the bread that I need. And in the NIV translation, it says, "Only give me my daily bread." And then it has a little reference as a cross reference, the Lord's Prayer, where we pray for daily bread. And in other translations, because they don't say daily bread and they don't make that reference, you wouldn't catch that richness of meaning of that provision that we need, that's core to our the way Jesus taught us to pray. But the NIV, the translators, somehow somebody thought to make that connection and render that in that way. And that just was very rich. I remember when I came across that. So that would be an example I would think of. Give me only my daily bread. I like that a lot. But I know I'm going on and on here, but when I was in college, I think something really interesting happened. There was a used bookstore called Books and Stock along Liberty, downtown, Liberty Street. And I went in and they had this interlinear edition of the Psalms, where it has the Hebrew text, and right below it has a very literal English translation. And I didn't know Hebrew at the time, but I started on my own learning the alphabet. My dad happened to have a book about Hebrew in his library at home. And so I started going through the Psalms slowly and using this interlinear translation, so I could try to pronounce the Hebrew word and then see a literal English translation. And this was really rich for me. And I've gone back to it from time to time over the years. And the same is true. That bookstore also had an interlinear Greek New Testament where I could do the same. And I hadn't had Greek yet, but I started trying to, learn the alphabet. And then when I went to seminary, it was great to have that foundation. So I just throw out there that interlinears are another way. They provide a translation, a very literal translation, but they're another way to try to connect with the original languages. So yeah. I think probably as somebody who's had to learn another language, and you've even studied biblical languages, do you enjoy the thought of just the mystery almost of the action of translating? I mean, when you think of reading scripture or talking about scripture, realizing that a lot of these conversations happen in light of translation or through translation, or you yourself are translating a lot. Like if you're in church and the service is in Japanese, and you're probably translating the sermon and maybe comparing it to your language you heard growing up. I just wonder, as somebody who does a lot with translation, what is your take on this whole topic of Bible translations? Do you feel that many are good, that it's nice to have variety?
Yeah, that made me think of a memory I have from Sunday school, and I think that Kim Hartman was our teacher, and I just remember, I don't know how old I was. I must have been so young, but I said to her, I said, "Did Jesus speak English or did he speak another language?" And somehow it occurred to me that, wait a minute, maybe he didn't grow up speaking English, and I couldn't quite complete that whole thought to the end that we're reading this translation. But yeah, I think because there, with especially living in another culture and other languages, there's so much more than just the words, and that I wonder how much of the feeling and the context and the subtext that we can get, and how to access that. I remember seeing on History Channel, they were kind of doing a reenactment, and it was set in I think maybe one actor was playing Jesus, and he was working with a coach who who was teaching him Aramaic. So actually, maybe it wasn't Jesus, but he was saying how in Aramaic, and I'm relating the secondhand, there are no words for colors. There's no word for green. And instead, it's like things that grow in the field, or like things that bloom, or like I think it's like things that are of nature. And then like you have to use these phrases to describe colors. And
Wow.
yeah. And I thought, wow, there is so much more to these languages than maybe that's even really possible to deliver without it being too bulky for us. But I really wonder, like I actually, just personally, I wanted to ask you this idea, when Jesus says, you have to carry your cross. What is the context of that statement? Because we, reading it after the crucifixion, come to it with a completely different interpretation than how was it taken exactly at that moment? What did it mean to bear your cross to the disciples and to the people listening to him at that moment? It's really interesting, and I don't know how to get that kind of context through, and then especially as people are translating and copying and recopying, then there's just this distance between what was said and how it was said and where it was said and the time that it was said, and how we read it. But that also gives us the freedom to let the text interact with how we're feeling, with our hearts, with what we're going through. And I think that's probably why, more than any other book, with the Bible, we say this or that speaks to me. And I think that's because it's written in a way that we're able to really interact with what we're
reading. We want to thank our listeners for joining us today in this conversation of the text of the Bible, its translation, its transmission. It's really enjoyable that we were able to revisit this after the first episode, simply of how we appreciated the Bible and how it related to our family life and our formation. we hope that you've heard something that piqued your interest that maybe you'll explore further. And until next time, goodbye.